They slapped me with a fine for legally hunting on my own property. So I did something no one expected. I bought the land behind their favorite hiking trail and shut it down permanently. What started as a quiet hobby turned into a war with the HOA. This is the story of how a simple man with a bow outsmarted an entire neighborhood committee. My name's Jake Mercer. I live just outside a small town in northern Georgia, surrounded by forest and silence. I moved out here to escape city noise, find peace, and enjoy a few hobbies, namely bow hunting and land management. I bought 10 acres near a mountain trail that led up to a ridge. I had deer stands, trail cameras, and even planted clover for wildlife. Everything was legal. I had my hunting license, permits, and followed every state law to the letter. But I forgot one thing. I had neighbors and one of them sat on the local HOA board. At first, everything was quiet. I didn't even realize there was an HOA involved. In my area, because my property wasn't part of any official subdivision, my land was zoned for agricultural use, not residential, and I paid for the seclusion I wanted. Then, one day, I got a letter. It was folded neatly and shoved into my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a formal complaint stating that I had violated HOA guidelines by engaging in hazardous outdoor activities. I laughed, assuming it was a prank. There were no rules against bow hunting on private land, especially not in unincorporated zones. I ignored it. A week later, I got another letter, this time certified. It included photos of me walking to one of my deer stands, of my truck parked on the gravel path, and even of a deer I'd harvested and was hauling out. The HOA accused me of endangering hikers and violating communal safety expectations. I couldn't believe it. The mountain trail that crossed near my property wasn't even on my land. It was adjacent to it, part of a public hiking trail maintained by a community group. But apparently, this HOA had taken it upon themselves to oversee trail usage and felt my presence nearby was dangerous. The board held a meeting and I was invited, more like summoned. I showed up, out of courtesy, more than anything. It was a small room filled with folding chairs and older folks sipping coffee, some of them giving me the side eye. I tried to explain that I followed every law, that my property wasn't subject to their rules, and that I was well within my rights. But they weren't interested in hearing any of that. One woman, a retired teacher named Marlene, claimed her dog was emotionally traumatized by the sound of my arrows hitting a target during practice. Another man said he didn't feel safe hiking anymore, even though I never hunted near the trail, or during busy hours. The board voted, and while they couldn't technically fine me for hunting, they issued a formal reprimand and said they'd be pursuing further action. That's when it escalated. Over the next month, I noticed more hikers, wandering closer to my land, peering in, some even stepping over the boundary markers. I put up signs, private property, no trespassing, but they were torn down within days. Then came the fine, $1,000 for public endangerment and violating the harmony of the community. I refused to pay it. I mailed them a letter stating that I was not under their jurisdiction. They responded by threatening legal action. That's when I decided if they wanted to play hardball, I'd play harder. I started doing some research. I found out the land the trail passed through, the same trail the HOA claimed to manage, was owned by a patchwork of small private landowners who had allowed public access over the years without charging or restricting much. And wouldn't you know it, a 5-acre section that sat right at the entrance of the trailhead had recently gone up for sale. The moment I saw the listing, I knew what I was going to do. I bought it, outright cash, no mortgage, just mine. It was expensive, but I considered it an investment not just in land, but in peace and principle. A month later, signs went up. Trail closed indefinitely, private property. And just like that, the most scenic part of the trail, the ridge with the panoramic views the hikers loved so much, was off limits. The HOA was furious. They demanded I reopen the trail. They sent angry letters, called town meetings, even tried to get the local media involved. I didn't budge. When a few trespassers decided to test me, I called the sheriff, showed my deed, and had them removed. I didn't press charges, but I made it clear I could. I also put up game cameras and posted the footage online of people ignoring the signs, some even vandalizing my fences. Public opinion shifted. Turns out, most folks didn't like the idea of harassing a private landowner who was minding his business. Eventually, the HOA quieted down. No more letters, no more fines. I resumed hunting on my property, planted more clover, and even built a little cabin for weekend retreats. The trail remained closed, and while a few hikers still grumbled about it, most found alternate routes. I wasn't trying to be a villain, I just wanted to be left alone. But when someone threatens your rights, your hobbies, and your peace of mind, sometimes the best response isn't arguing, it's ownership. In the end, I didn't just protect my land. I made a point that respect goes both ways, and if you poke the quiet guy in the woods too many times, don't be surprised if he buys the path you use to complain about him. One cold morning in November, I was field dressing a deer near my back tree line. when a woman walked up the trail and started yelling at me like I was committing some kind of crime. "You can't do that here," she screamed. "This is a family area." She was red-faced, angry, and clearly unfamiliar with both the law and the boundaries of my property. I calmly told her I was well within my rights. I was on private land, a full 50 feet inside my property line, and I was doing something entirely legal. But she wouldn't listen. She just huffed off, muttering something about the HOA. Think much of it until 2 days later when a letter arrived in my mailbox from the Homeowners Association. It stated that I had been fined $1,000 for dangerous activities within HOA vicinity, and included a formal warning that future threats to public safety could bring legal consequences. I was stunned. I didn't even know the HOA had jurisdiction anywhere near my land. My property was on the edge of their development, technically outside the neighborhood, but close enough to the public hiking trail that apparently some people thought they had a say in what I did. I gathered everything I needed for my appeal: GPS data showing my exact coordinates when I was hunting, footage from one of my trail cameras proving I hadn't stepped off my own land, and a printout of the county hunting regulations that explicitly supported my right to hunt on private land during open season. I sent it all in with a polite but firm letter. A week later, they rejected the appeal. Their reasoning: my activity, even if technically legal, created discomfort and alarm among community members and thus violated the HOA's community standards. That's when everything changed. If they wanted to play dirty and try to intimidate me, I decided I'd fight back in a way they wouldn't see coming. I did some research and discovered that the land adjacent to mine, the same land the hiking trail crossed, was owned by a timber company. And better yet, it was up for sale in parcels. I made a few calls, arranged some financing, and within 6 weeks, I owned the narrow stretch of land between my property and the rest of the HOA neighborhood, including the portion of trail where that woman had yelled at me. It wasn't cheap, but it was worth every cent. Once the paperwork was finalized, I put up signs: private property, no trespassing, trail closed. I even had a gate installed across the entrance. The backlash was immediate. HOA members started posting on local forums, demanding to know who had shut down their beloved trail. I ignored the noise. A few of them tried to come down in person, acting like they had a right to use the path. I simply pointed to the signs and the legal documents. One guy even tried to argue with me about community access rights, but the sheriff confirmed I was in the clear. Still, the HOA wouldn't let it go. They called a meeting and sent me another letter, asking to negotiate some kind of easement to reopen the trail. They offered me $5,000 to allow limited access during daylight hours. I declined. Then they tried to threaten me with bad press in the community newsletter. I laughed. I didn't live in their community, didn't use their amenities, and certainly didn't care what their Facebook group thought of me. What I did care about was my peace, my rights, and making sure nobody ever tried to push me around again. Eventually, the HOA tried to escalate things legally, claiming the closure of the trail was retaliatory and harmed property values. But once again, the law was on my side. My attorney responded with a simple message: my client owns the land. He is under no obligation to provide recreational access to the public. The case was dropped before it even began. Months passed. The trail remained closed. Some neighbors tried to create a makeshift path through a different area, but that land was also under contract and I was in talks to buy it, too. By spring, I had acquired enough land to ensure no trail would ever come within shouting distance of my property again. The deer returned, the woods were quiet, and I enjoyed my hunts in peace. Occasionally I'd hear grumbling from the direction of the old trailhead, but I didn't care. I wasn't trying to be a villain, I was just defending what was mine. If the HOA had handled things with a conversation instead of a fine and a threat, things might have gone differently. But they picked the wrong guy to mess with. I didn't raise my voice, didn't break a single law, and didn't owe them anything. All I did was use their arrogance against them. In the end, the HOA lost more than just the trail. They lost the illusion of control, and I gained something better than revenge. I gained quiet, freedom, and the satisfaction of knowing I stood up for myself in a way that truly mattered. For years, the HOA boasted loudly and proudly about the scenic 30-acre hiking trail that wound through hills, creeks, and thick Georgia pines behind our neighborhood. It was their crown jewel, their community flexed thing they mentioned at every annual meeting and bragged about 2 new buyers. There were flyers about it in the clubhouse, photos in newsletters, and signs pointing people to the trailhead, which they had marked with a shiny wooden archway and their logo carved into a metal plaque. Residents took full advantage of it: morning dog walks, weekend family hikes, school field trips, and even group yoga sessions at the ridge that overlooked the valley. Everyone in the neighborhood thought of the trail as ours, something that HOA provided and maintained for the benefit of the community. But something had always seemed off to me. I'd lived in the area for a few years and paid attention to property lines and parcels. especially because I owned a few wooded acres myself. Nearby, when I started getting HOA letters warning me about setting up a deer stand too close to community land, I decided to do some quiet research. I pulled up the county GIS maps and spent a few nights studying the records. That's when I stumbled upon something that flipped the whole story on its head. The entire hiking trail wasn't actually owned by the HOA. It was a patchwork mess of different private properties that had, over time, become an unofficial public trail. The HOA never owned more than about 2 acres of it, just enough for the entry and the first few bends. But the wild part was right in the center of the trail, a 13-acre parcel, thick with trees and brush, that every single hiker passed through without realizing it. That parcel wasn't owned by the HOA or the county. It was privately owned by an elderly couple who had moved out of state nearly a decade ago. The property had no structures, wasn't fenced, and had fallen completely off the radar of most locals. According to the tax records, they'd been quietly paying their dues every year, unaware that dozens of strangers were walking across their land every weekend. I managed to track them down, an older couple living in Arizona now, both retired, and completely shocked to hear that people were using their land like a public park. They hadn't visited the property in years and thought it was still just untouched woods. They didn't even remember the trail cutting through it. When I asked if they'd ever considered selling, the husband laughed and said, "Honestly, I'd love to stop paying taxes on something we'll never use again." I offered them $35,000 cash for the parcel. No games, no negotiations. I told them I'd handle the paperwork, title transfer, everything. They agreed within a week. A month later, I had the deed in hand. I now owned the exact 13 acres that cut right through the middle of the trail the HOA had proudly claimed for years. I didn't announce anything. No signs, no warnings. I simply hired a local fencing company and over the course of a weekend had a tall, no-nonsense privacy fence installed at both entry points to my land. Hikers trying to walk through suddenly found themselves at a dead end, staring at metal signs that read private property, no trespassing. The chaos that followed was glorious. Within days, the HOA inbox was flooded with complaints. People were furious. Why can't we access the trail anymore? Who put up this ugly fence? This is public land. The HOA board scrambled to figure out what happened. At the next meeting, they nervously explained that a dispute over land rights had interrupted trail access and that they were looking into solutions. I didn't say a word. I just sat in the back, arms crossed. While they squirmed a few days later, the HOA president knocked on my door. She came with a forced smile and a folder in her hands. "We were wondering if you'd consider granting an easement," she said, trying to act like this was a small misunderstanding, maybe even selling it back to the HOA. "We could work out something fair." I smiled politely and said I wasn't interested. I told her I'd bought the land for personal use, privacy, peace, maybe even a future cabin. I reminded her that for years they had imposed rules and fines on me while using someone else's land as their own. She left with a fake smile and a clear sense of defeat. That week, the trail signs came down. The archway was quietly removed. The flyers stopped mentioning the 30-acre hike, and the HOA had to eat a massive slice of humble pie in front of the entire neighborhood. Residents were outraged not at me, but at the HOA. They felt duped, misled, and betrayed. Some even demanded partial refunds on their dues, claiming that the biggest perk the HOA had sold them on was never theirs to begin with. Meanwhile, I enjoyed my new 13 acres in peace. No more surprise visitors near my property line. No more weekend crowds. Just me, the trees, and a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or angry, it's quiet, legal, and carved right into the deed. Within a month, I owned the land and posted private property, nitrogen monoxide trespassing signs at every entry point. I also installed trail cameras to monitor every movement and sent official notices to both the HOA and the local sheriff's department, making it absolutely clear that the land was no longer available for public use in any form. The reaction was explosive and immediate. My inbox filled with angry emails, handwritten notes were left on my front porch, and more than a few knocks came to my door from frustrated neighbors hoping to talk it out. The HOA scrambled to schedule an emergency meeting that same week, where they tried to frame the situation as a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, but I knew better. They begged me to be reasonable, to think of the children, to remember how much the community loved and needed that trail. A few even tried to guilt me by saying their families had walked those woods for generations, that it was practically tradition. Then came the most insulting part. They offered to drop the bogus hunting fine they had slapped me with just weeks earlier if I reopened access to the trail. It was meant to be a peace offering, a way to smooth things over without actually apologizing or admitting fault, but it was too late for that. I had spent years trying to be a good neighbor. I followed every rule they laid out, even the ones that didn't make sense. I attended HOA meetings, stayed quiet during debates, and paid my dues. Without complaint, I participated in community cleanup hikes, donated to fundraisers, and even helped maintain part of the trail system that didn't even cross my property just to keep the peace. I asked for nothing in return, except the basic decency of being left alone on my own land. But when one of their members saw me legally field dressing a deer near my own tree line in my land, they decided to weaponize the HOA against me. They filed a complaint, imposed a fine, and dragged my name through the neighborhood message boards as some kind of dangerous outsider. All because I chose to live quietly and enjoy legal hunting on my own property. The irony was brutal. They trespassed regularly, but the moment I did something they didn't like on my land, suddenly I was a threat to their family environment. So I responded the only way I could with facts, ownership papers, and signs that could be read from 50 feet away. And just like that, their prized trail was severed. The continuous path that linked the neighborhood to the ridge views was cut in half. Weekend hikes were canceled. Dog runs disappeared. School outings and yoga groups vanished overnight. The once busy ridge, once echoing with laughter and the crunch of boots, now sat silent, watched only by my trail cameras and the occasional passing deer. I'd see families drive up, get out with their water bottles and walking sticks, then notice the signs, scowl, and turn around. The HOA tried other tactics too, offering to buy the land back, claiming it wasn't right for one person to control access to something so beautiful, but that beauty had only mattered to them as long as it served their convenience. When I had asked for mutual respect, they chose control instead. So now they could live with their decision. I wasn't interested in revenge when all this started. I just wanted to be left alone. But the moment they tried to punish me for something they didn't even understand, they made it personal. I didn't go looking for this fight. They brought it to my doorstep and I finished it at the deed office. Some folks still try to paint me as the villain, the guy who ruined everything for the whole community. But most of them don't even know the full story. They don't know about the woman who yelled at me like I was a criminal in my own backyard. They don't know how the HOA fine felt like a targeted attack, one that assumed I'd just roll over and take it. They don't see the double standard. The hypocrisy of pretending the trail was theirs to begin with, when it was never legally theirs at all. What they had was an illusion of borrowed freedom built on land that never belonged to them. I simply took back what was mine and reminded them that actions have consequences. The land is mine now, and it will remain closed. No more shortcuts, no more uninvited guests, no more entitled assumptions. The signs stay up, the cameras stay running, and the ridge stays empty. That's not spite, it's boundaries. Boundaries they ignored for too long. 6 months later, the land remains closed, silent, and untouched except for the occasional deer or rustle of leaves in the wind. The private property, no trespassing signs I put up still stand tall at every entry point, weathered but clear. The trail cameras still capture the occasional curious passerby who quickly turns around once they see the posted warnings. The HOA, furious and embarrassed, tried to take me to court, claiming community necessity and public right-of-way, but my deed was ironclad. The judge ruled in my favor without hesitation. I hadn't broken any laws. I had simply exercised my rights as a property owner. Their lawsuit collapsed like a poorly built deck, and with it, their access to one of the most treasured features of their neighborhood, that scenic ridge trail that wound through what used to be a quiet, shared natural space. The same trail they'd bragged about in real estate listings and HOA newsletters. The same trail where they took weekend walks, hosted dog runs, and even organized school outings. All gone. I didn't do this out of malice. I didn't wake up one day deciding to ruin anyone's recreational plans. But there comes a time when a person has to stand up for themselves, especially when pushed into a corner by entitled neighbors and arrogant community leaders. When that woman confronted me last fall, yelling that I couldn't dress a deer on my own land, it struck a nerve. When the HOA sent me a fine and warning notice for improper hunting activity, it lit a fire. I had tried to explain, I had tried to compromise, but they didn't care. They wanted control. They wanted to make an example out of me. They thought I would roll over and comply because they represented a larger group, but I am not one to be bullied. So I did my homework. I studied the land records. I discovered that the trail, while maintained and celebrated by the HOA, crossed a patchwork of private land parcels. 13 of those acres were up for private sale, and, to my surprise, not yet claimed by any government or park entity. That's when I made my move. I bought the land quietly, legally, and without needing to involve them. Within a month, I owned the section of trail that they all used the most, and as soon as the ink was dry, I locked the gates and put up those signs. Then came the backlash emails, angry knocks at my door, passive-aggressive posts on local forums, and yes, that desperate lawsuit, but none of it mattered. I wasn't violating any rules. I was merely defending what was mine. The sheriff confirmed it, the county clerk backed it up, and the court sealed the deal. Now, I still walk those trails, only they're not community trails anymore. They're mine. I still hunt quietly in the mornings, still listen to the wind rustle through the trees, and still enjoy the peace I moved out here to find in the first place. The silence is even sweeter now, knowing it's not being disturbed by people who once treated me like I didn't belong. And every time I pass that locked gate, the one that used to be their favorite shortcut to the ridge, I feel no guilt. I just remember that this all could have been avoided. All they had to do was respect my space, understand that I had just as much right to enjoy the land as they did, and leave me alone. But they couldn't do that. They wanted to control it all. And in doing so, they lost the best part of their neighborhood. Sometimes, standing your ground means being seen as the villain in someone else's story. But I'm okay with that, because, in my story, I protected my land, my peace, and my principles. I didn't ask for conflict, but I didn't back down from it either. And now, 6 months later, while the HOA stews and the trail remains overgrown and empty, I continue to live quietly, freely, and on my own terms. Some battles aren't fought in courtrooms or with lawyers. Sometimes, standing your ground means knowing your rights and playing the long game. Thanks for watching this story unfold. If you're into real-life twists, neighborhood showdowns, and unexpected endings, make sure to subscribe to Beyond Tales, where every story takes you deeper than you imagined.